Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday night worship. You may notice something a little bit different about tonight. As I was reading through chapter 7, and also as I was reading through chapter 8, a thought occurred to me. We have been doing teaching first and then music second, because back when we were in the Psalms, the best way, in my opinion, to react to what's going on in the Psalms is to sing songs, right? To sing psalms back to God. As we've been in Amos, particularly in these two chapters, 7 and 8, it's occurred to me it doesn't feel right after judgment to kind of sing songs. And you may disagree with me on this, and that's okay. But I think for at least these 2 weeks, it'll be good for us to sing our faith first as a way of putting ourselves in the right headspace, the right heart space, to hear these very hard words from the prophet Amos. And so again, we flip-flopped it again. Sheldon will present some music and some worship for us first as we sort of put our hearts in the right place before God. And then after that, we will move into the teaching time where hopefully our hearts have been prepared to listen to what God has to say through this prophet, not only to the people of history, but to us as well. So thank you for joining us tonight. Music is first, and so I'm going to hand it over to Sheldon. He's going to play some music for us, and then we'll get back into the teaching after our music time.
Water you turned into wine, open the eyes of the blind. There's no one like you, none like you. Into the darkness you shine, out of the ashes we rise. There's no one like you, none like you. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Water you turned into wine, open the eyes of the blind. There's no one like you, none like you. Into the darkness you shine, out of the ashes we rise. There's no one like you, none like you. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what could stand against? And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, what could stand against? What could stand against? Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. Our God is greater, our God is stronger. God, you are higher than any other. Our God is healer, awesome in power. Our God, our God. time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly choose you now. Come, now is the time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come. Willingly we choose to surrender our lives. Willingly our knees will bow. With all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we gladly choose you now. Come, now is the time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come, come, come. I could just sit and wait for all your goodness, hope to feel your presence. I could just stay right where I am and hope to feel you, hope to feel something again. I could hold on to who I am and never let you change me from the inside. I could be safe, oh, I could be safe here in your arms and never leave home, never let these walls down. But you have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You have called me higher, you have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You lead me. You lead me, Lord. I could hold on to who I am and never let you change me from the inside. I could be safe, oh, I could be safe here in your arms and never leave home, never let these walls down. You have called me higher. You have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You have called me higher. You have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You lead me. You lead me, Lord. I will be yours, oh, I will be yours for all my life. I will be yours, oh, I will be yours for all my life. I will be yours, oh, I will be yours for all my life, so let your mercy. I will be yours, Lord, I will be yours for all my life, so let your mercy light the path before me. You have called me higher. You have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You have called me higher. You have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. 'Cause you have called me higher. You have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. 'Cause you have called me higher. You have called me deeper, and I'll go where you will lead me, Lord. You lead me. You lead me, Lord. You lead me. You lead me, Lord.
Greetings and welcome everyone to Wednesday night worship. As we continue in our study of the book of Amos, we're plowing through. I don't know what else we can say about Amos than we're plowing through. It's an exciting book, but it gets tedious after a while as we just hear judgment after judgment, as I've been saying the last couple of weeks. But nevertheless, we'll go into Amos chapter 7. Again, if you haven't read Amos chapter 7, I would encourage you to go ahead and just pause the video right now. Read Amos chapter 7. It's a very quick read, just real quick, and then come back because, again, it's been very hard when we're dealing with larger chunks of Scripture to spend time reading it all when you are capable of doing that yourselves. And so really what we're doing here is commenting on the text. And so again, if you haven't read it, pause, read Amos 7, and come right back. I won't go anywhere, I promise. But as we dive in to Amos chapter 7, again, we'll remember that it's been judgment from Amos 1 until here, that it's just Amos sort of relentlessly pressuring and pushing on, and he's dealt in chapter 6 with the complacency of Israel, and then ultimately with this idea of the people who think everything is going great, and yet obvious that things are not going great. Amos basically is telling the truth about how things are really going when the people think that things are going fine. And so as we enter into chapter 7, we get visions, which is really the first real kind of visionary experience that Amos has, at least in our text. As we're talking, he has a vision. Oftentimes this is not unusual for prophets to have visions. I mean, if you think about Ezekiel, he had visions that are so out there and so crazy that they really defy explanation. You have visions of wheels within wheels and wheels covered with eyes, right? That's Ezekiel. We can go to John in Revelation, and John has these visions of heaven, of heavenly worship, visions of beasts coming out of the sea, right? Oftentimes, prophets were called seers because they had visions that they believed and they asserted were from God, and they begin to tell those visions to the people and interpret them for the people. Or, as in the case of Amos here, Amos has visions, doesn't really know what they mean, and then God comes and kind of provides interpretation. Yahweh comes and interprets those visions for Amos, and then Amos ostensibly is to relay those visions to the people, or relay what God is speaking and saying and doing to the people. And so we have that here. And these are, again, I don't want to say they're unique visions, but they're different sorts of visions, because at least these two seem to be visions that are largely just for the prophet. He has these visions, and then the visions cause him to interact with Yahweh in certain ways, and yet there's no real call to say, okay, go ahead and tell these visions to the people, or this is what's going to happen. But rather, it's a vision given to Amos, and Amos, without telling the people, then intercedes on behalf of the people. It's a very interesting visionary experience. And so we'll get into that. So the first vision that Amos has is of a swarm of locusts. If you've been with us on Wednesday Night Worship for a while, and you recognize the language of locusts, that Joel talks about an army of locusts coming and devouring everything. But here Amos has this vision of locusts coming at a particular time of the year. The text literally says at the time of the king's harvest. And what scholars think that means is that this is the time when the kind of the first gleanings of the first season's harvest are coming in. So the king's kind of entitled to the first part of the harvest. So that's just starting to be brought in, but still in the fields. And yet the next harvest, or the next planting, the crops have sprouted and begun to grow. And so this time where both winter, summer, I don't remember the exact seasons, but where these two seasons, the main seasons of harvest of food bearing for the people of Israel, are in the fields at the same time. And so Amos has this vision of the locusts coming and destroying, utterly destroying everything. So if your summer harvest is destroyed while it's just before you've harvested it, and your winter harvest is destroyed just as it's coming out of the ground, you have no food for the rest of the year. Think of the utter and complete devastation that this is talking about here. It's not that there is little harvest or there's droughts, or that there's an anemic harvest, but there is no harvest because the locusts have eaten everything. It is doom, it is destruction, it is complete destruction for the people of Israel. And this causes Amos to react very viscerally, and instead of kind of relaying judgment to the people, Amos comes back and he talks to God, and he basically cries out to God and says, "Oh, God, what's going on?" It says, "I beg you to stop. How can Jacob survive?" And then he says this, that Jacob is too small, right? So this idea that Amos is by interceding on behalf of the people and saying, God, Israel's too small to withstand what's going to happen. That kind of judgment, they cannot survive that. Now, if you've paid attention through Amos, God has said, Israel will not survive. But this is even too far. Amos feels this deeply and in his gut, and just reacts against it and says, God, don't do this. It's too much for Israel to bear. Some would say that Amos here is actually reminding God of God's preference for the little guy, for the oppressed, for the weakling, right? That God stands on the sides of those who are weak. And so it's almost as if, and some people believe, that Amos is coming saying, God, what about your preference for the weak? Israel talks a big game, as we've seen in Amos. They talk big. But Amos is saying, but they're so small, they can't withstand this. So again, it's a very visceral and almost scary image where we have the prophet doing what the prophets often do in scriptures, right? We know that the prophets come and bring messages, from on high to the people, but prophets also represent the people back to God. Think about Moses on Sinai when God says, I am going to destroy them and start over with you, and yet Moses says, wait a minute, God, remember your promises to your people. What are the generations going to say about you if you destroy them in the wilderness? right? So Amos, or excuse me, in that instance, Moses representing the people back to God, or you know, we might think of Abraham, who when God says, I'm gonna burn Sodom, right? Abraham begins to bargain for the life of the people of Sodom. God, will you destroy everything? If there's 50 righteous people there, are you still going to destroy it? And some would say that Abraham bargains God down to 10. So that kind of thing's going on there, is of Amos actually representing the people back to God. And what's amazing here is that God relents. God perhaps changes God's mind, or God changes God's course in the path that God had intended for the people of Israel, right? So Amos says, how can Jacob survive? He is so small. And then we're told that the Lord relented and said, this will not happen. So the locust, the plague of locusts that is promised here it's not a metaphor for something. It's basically something God said would happen. I'm going to do this, and then God relents, right? So again, somewhat like for the people of Nineveh, right, that we'll study later in Jonah, where the people cry out and God stops. He says, I won't bring the calamity that I had planned upon Nineveh. And in this case, God stops, God relents, God shows mercy, and does not do the thing that by all intents and purposes God had planned for the people of Israel. And there's not much commentary on that before, again, we move into the next judgment oracle, or the next vision that Amos has. So the next vision Amos has is judgment by fire, right? That it dried up everything, dried up the great deep. The great deep was the sea, right? The sea is the great deep, the waters under the earth that give life to the earth. Even that is dried up. And the fire devours the whole land. Again, Amos sees this just sort of utter destruction, right? For those of us in the West, we've seen some of this fire activity over the last several years, this year included, of just these fires that wipe out everything. And this is what Amos sees concerning Israel. And again, he cries out, oh God, don't do this. Don't do what you have planned. How can Jacob endure this? He is so small. Again, those same words are used for describing what God is doing, and describing Amos pleading on behalf of the people for God to either relent, perhaps to forgive the people. And again, what is perhaps amazing, at least to us who consider God sort of just what God says goes and there's no shifting or turning, right, is that God relents once again. God, if not forgives, then chooses not to do this particular act of judgment in the land upon the people of Israel. Again, that this represents sort of this twofold office of the prophet. Right? Prophets are called by God to present God to the people. Right? This, thus saith the Lord. But also at times to represent the people back to God, to intercede on their behalf. Right? This is what we would hope that Jonah would do for the people of Nineveh, but he didn't. This is what, again, other of the prophets have done before God, have represented. We think of perhaps Isaiah, when God gives kind of the vision in Isaiah 6, right? Go and I'm going to burn everything, and if a 10th part remains, I'm going to burn it again. Right? Go and tell these things to the people. And Isaiah says, how long, O Lord? Right? How long do I have to keep this up? How long do I have to bring the bad news? Again, God, when's the good news coming? Intercedes on behalf of the people. God, surely there is redemption at the end of this judgment. And again, Amos is serving in that prophetic role of representing the people back to God. God, this seems too much and too far. God, remember, your people are so small. They are puffed up. They are prideful. They act tough and they act big, but they cannot withstand this. And again, God relents. And then there's a third vision that goes on, and this is the vision of the plumb line. And again, here, there is no intercession on behalf of Amos. And ultimately, you have to be honest, as with lots of this kind of stuff, we don't ultimately know what this means. Plumb line is sort of the scholar's best guess at what's going on here, but not real clear. But what is clear is what essentially God says, right? God asks Amos, what do you see? He says, I see a plumb line. And then God says, I am setting this plumb line among my people, and I will spare them no longer. So taking the plumb line metaphor, right, God is holding this thing that is supposed to, right, you hold it up to a wall to see if that wall is vertical or leaning, right? If the wall is leaning and is not constructed right, it's going to fall over. And so it's almost as if God's saying, look, the plumb line is there. This is what is true. This is what is right. This is what is good. This is vertical. And the people have veered so far off vertical that I cannot ignore the problem any longer, right? If you have leaning walls in your house, eventually they will lean so far as to fall. And it's almost as if God is saying this about it. I can't ignore these leaning walls. I have to fix what is wrong in Israel. And God has said all along through Amos that what God sees wrong in Israel is worthy of total destruction for the people of Israel. Now, whether we're here, whether that's what's operative in this particular vision, we don't know. But God says, I cannot spare them any longer. I cannot ignore what has happened any longer. And so the high place of Isaac will be destroyed. The sanctuaries of Israel will be ruined. With my sword I will rise against the house of Jeroboam. And we see that language coming back again, that those people who thought, and by all accounts seem to think God is still on their side, those people, God is saying, I am coming against them. They have set themselves against me. I am coming at them. When God arises with a sword, it is not for peace. All right, so God says, I'm arising with my sword for judgment against them. I'm going to tear down the sanctuaries. Again, the operative idea there is that their worship is idolatrous at worst and empty at best. And so God is ready to deal sort of the death knell to that whole thing that's going on in Israel. Sheldon.
That plumb line is something I don't think I've ever really understood what it was. And I think that's a very thought-provoking image of God and his standards, his commandments. But aside from that, do you think in this there are these kind of three obvious visions? Is there any kind of significance with there being three and the third one being kind of like the final line being drawn? And then in addition to that, in kind of how it's formed in each one, because the first two are very similar in their form and the third one is different. Is there any significance to that?
Is there significance? Probably. I think it's important, especially as we read the scriptures, any of the scriptures, I think we ought to approach it giving the idea that most of what is put down is probably intentional. We might look at the letters of Paul and say those might be more ad hoc sort of things where he maybe has not set down and outlined everything that's going on. But especially as we're looking at the Old Testament, because the history of the Old Testament is so long, and there is ample evidence of that editing has happened, right? That things might have been moved, truncated, or put in certain places for certain reasons. That's what good writers do, right? Fiction or nonfiction, that's what you do, right? You edit, and that's how you craft a good narrative, or that's how you craft a good whatever, right? I've read biographies that are edited well, and I thought they read like novels, and there's others that I thought were pretty bad. But they're always intentionally done. And I would say, especially as we're looking at prophets, these are intentionally done. There's no reason why we would assume that A, God didn't intend it how it was, and God generally thinks things through, or B, that those who have edited this, who have put it together in the form that we have, that wasn't intentional. We should probably assume it's intentional. Now, there's another vision coming up in chapter 8. So that the whole idea of three may not be as operative, because there's this three visions. There's a large chunk, this next 10 through 17 in chapter 7, and then coming back in chapter 8, there's another vision. So, I don't know that the three, but the three as they are is probably it's sort of a this, not this, but that. Right? So if we think about maybe in that kind of idea of the prophet presents this vision, right? God says, here's this vision, not this. Here's this other vision, not this, right? Not complete and total destruction as the locust might bring, or not complete and total destruction as the fire might bring, right? Those two things would result in the probably death of many, if not most, right? But the plumb line is a different sort of thing, right? It's almost a way of God stepping back and saying, the how, locust fire, those are how. And Amos says, that's God too much, and God relents and says, okay, I won't do it that way, I won't do it that way. And then the third one is not a how, it's a this is what's going on, and I cannot ignore it any longer. It's almost as if, and again, this could be, this could not, this is my just thinking off the cuff, is that God is essentially saying, okay, maybe not, but I have to do something. Right? Amos, you see, yes, the fire may be too much, the locust may be too much, but Amos, the wall is not true. And it's either going to fall on its own or I have to fix it somehow, and sometimes the best way to fix a leaning wall, in fact, probably the only time best way to fix a leaning wall is to tear it down and build it again. And so again, God says, okay, maybe not how, but I have to do something. And that's what perhaps the plumb line, where it is intended to show. Because it's not a how, it's a what. What's going on? Why is God toying with options on how to bring judgment upon the people of Israel? Because the wall is so far out of true. And God has to do something, because the wall out of true is not just going to fall over, it is causing injustice, and it is causing God's name to be perhaps slandered among the nations. So again, I don't know that that's the best explanation, but that seems to me what's going on operatively here is the first two are, yes, I'm bringing judgment, and here's how. Amos says, God, that's intense, that's too much. And then God says, but I'm going to do something. You can see that I have to do something. Because if you look at the plumb line, compared to the wall, again, there's no mention of a wall here, but then that's what's going to happen. Right? The plumb line shows what is true, what is good, what is center, right? Where the bottom ought to be if the top is located somewhere. I mean, all those sort of things, that's what a plumb line does. And if something deviates, then it has to be dealt with. So I guess that would be my answer. I hope some of you in your discussion of this have a better answer that you might have. Feel free to put it in the comments or send us an email as to what you think that perhaps the significance of that might be. Okay, so moving on to the next bit here. So again, just knowing that in chapter 8 another vision comes, there's kind of an interlude here where Amos has been having these visionary experiences, and all this has been sort of oracles of judgment, and Amos describing what he's seeing. And then we get to one of the very few narrative parts of this particular book where the prophet narrates some of the things that were going on. And so what we hear in 10 to 17 is sort of this truncated conversation and truncated story of what is going on in kind of the halls of power in Israel as Amos is speaking these things to the people, or at Bethel, which is, again, the place of the sanctuary of the Lord. So what we get is we have basically the priest at Bethel, whose name is Amaziah, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. It could be right, it could be wrong. Basically goes to Jeroboam II and begins to tattle and tell Jeroboam II what Amos is doing. So this high priest comes and he goes to perhaps Samaria or wherever Jeroboam has his palace and says, there's this guy down in Bethel, and you know what he's saying? He's talking about the destruction of Israel, and he is talking about the destruction of you, right? And he's talking about your death, that you'll be deposed and killed. Now, if you, again, hopefully you've read chapter 7. If you did read chapter 7, you notice that this high priest at Bethel relays the negative stuff that Amos says, right? Israel is going to go into exile, Jeroboam will be deposed and killed, without actually saying why. So it's sort of disingenuous. He is being a good politician, not saying both sides of the story, or only giving enough information to make himself look good and the people look good. But Amaziah doesn't go to Jeroboam II and say, and he says it's because we're on the wrong side of God. He just says, he's been saying all these nasty things about you, right? We could compare that to some of the reports that come out of, well, any sort of like protest or anything like that, right? These protests are happening, the people are saying, that there's racism out there and they're burning things down. Versus the full report would be maybe these things are happening, but they're doing it because they're calling for more justice in our system, right? There is two sides to that story. Or there is a whole story that, if not condones the first part, at least explains it, right? So Amaziah is leaving out that part about why. And that part's the most important part when it comes to prophetic literature, right? These things are going to happen is only half the story, and the bad part of the story, the why, oftentimes indicates a way of remedying the situation or a course of action in light of. So if someone comes to me and says, this guy over there has been saying how you're going to die and how your church is going to burn to the ground, I would be concerned. But if they said, he said you're going to do that because he noticed a fault in your electricity, oh, well, I should go fix the electricity, right? Before the building burns down. It gives remedy to fix, right? But Amaziah doesn't do that. He plays he does not serve the priestly role of representing God's view to the people, or the king in that case. He just simply says what the king wants to hear because ostensibly the prophet or the priest wants to get rid of the prophet, right? Amaziah wants Amos to go away. And so he gets Jeroboam II mad so that he can go back to Amos, and what happens next is Amaziah goes to Amos and says, you know what, you're stirring up all sorts of trouble. Go and make your living as a prophet somewhere else. Go back to Judah where you belong, right? Prophesy there. Make them scared. Do whatever you need to do there, but quit prophesying here. Now, remember, the prophecies here are specific for Israel. And Amaziah says, you're doing this in the worst possible place, right? You're at Bethel. This is the king's sanctuary, the king's holy city. So don't do it here. You're just stirring up trouble, right? It's like people saying to Martin Luther King, don't go to D.C., right? That's where the seats of power are. Prophesy, protest somewhere else, right? Don't stand in front of the Lincoln Memorial and do it. Do it somewhere else. Essentially, it's like someone saying to Dr. King, go back to Montgomery or whatever. Go back to Georgia. But that's not the purpose. That's not the point. God has specifically sent Amos to prophesy, but Amaziah is not okay with it. Presumably on Jeroboam II's orders, Amaziah tells him to go prophesy elsewhere. He's causing alarm and panic. Like we hear that language, right? You're causing people to be scared. Tone it down a little bit, right? And then accuses or calls Amos a professional prophet. That is, go and make your living elsewhere, indicates that the reason Amos is doing this is so that he gets a paycheck. Now, professional prophets were a thing. There were colleges of prophets. We hear about, Elisha in specific. There's stories where they go to the school of prophets, right? So this was a thing where it was a quote-unquote profession, if such a thing could be said about the ancient world in that way. But it's an accusation that he's getting money out of it, right? You're stirring up trouble so you can make money or you can earn a living. Go and do that elsewhere. Go stir up trouble elsewhere. Go and make your paycheck elsewhere. And that's when Amos comes back and says, whoa, dude, wait a minute, just a second. I'm not a prophet by training. I don't make any money off this. This is not my gig. This is not my bailiwick, so to speak. He says, I'm a farmer, right? I'm a dresser of sycamore trees or sycamore fig trees, right? I'm a shepherd. My job was not this. I didn't particularly want to do this. I was just minding my own agricultural business when God says go and prophesy. And we've heard elsewhere that when God says prophesy, Amos believes he has to go. When God says go, the prophet or any righteous person says, I must go regardless of what it costs me or the trouble it stirs up. And this is what Amos is saying. I'm just a farmer. This isn't my job. But God said go. God gave me these words. God gave me this vision. I can do nothing else but speak. This is kind of the same kind of language when some of the early apostles are confronted by the Sanhedrin. They say, well, whether you want us to do it here or there is immaterial, but we've been given this word. God told us to speak, and so we have to speak. Whether you think that's right is up to you, but we have to do what God has told us to do. And that's what Amos is saying. I have to do what God has told me to do. He speaks to Israel because that is precisely where God has sent him. He can't prophesy to Israel in Judah. We know what happens when prophets try to run away. Let's go back to Jonah. Jonah, go prophesy to Nineveh. That's great. I'm going elsewhere. I'm going to Tarshish. I'm going to get on a boat. It didn't work. Jonah is that example of when God says go and the prophet doesn't. God brings the prophet by hook or by crook, right, where he needs to go, where the prophet needs to go, right? So Jonah tries to run away. God says, hey, big fish, why don't you take him to Nineveh? And there he goes. He's there. Ta-da. So Amos says, I must go. And as a result of Amaziah actively encouraging Amos to forsake the call of God in his life, to abandon what God has told him to do, Amos pronounces judgment on Amaziah and on Amaziah's family. There's an interesting note of cultural, of communal judgment here. Right? Amaziah is the one who comes, but it's his family, we're told, that suffers as well. Right? What does it say here? Let me look it up because it bears repeating. Your wife will become a prostitute. Your sons and your daughters will fall by the sword. Your land will be measured and divided up, and you yourself will die in a pagan country. There is collective harm done by that individual sin. And it's difficult because we want to say, wait, why should anyone else suffer for Amaziah's sin? But I think there's something operative here that we ought to understand, that sin is not ever strictly a matter of the individual and God. That is to say, every sin, no matter how big, small, hidden, or overt, has consequences for the community in which we live, the web of relationships we have. If we break and forsake the primary relationship, us and God, all other relationships will fall and will be harmed by that. And so that's what happens here. And it's sort of a stand-in, because basically what Amos says is, you have forsaken and you have actively set yourself against the will and the way of God. That's right. If God says to Amos, go to Israel, and yet someone, a priest in Israel, says, no, go somewhere else, right? That person is setting themselves actively against God and God's command and God's will. That person has broken the covenant. And not only will Amaziah suffer the consequences of breaking the covenant, but so will his family. And that's hard and that's sad. And then ultimately we see Israel too, right? It's almost the same as says, you can tell me to go somewhere else, and I could go somewhere else, but that's not going to change the fact that you will go into exile, and Israel will go into exile, and the people of the land will suffer for the sins of those who are in power. And that is a striking thing. Israel is going to suffer largely for the sins of the people who are in power, who are forsaking the covenants and leading the people astray. I mean, it's sort of a woe to you teachers and woe to you leaders kind of way of thinking about things, but it's important for us to think about that there is collective harm done by the individual sin. And it's not because God doesn't love the collective, it's because sin is disastrous to all relationships. And when sin is allowed to run rampant, all relationships ultimately will suffer.
It takes a pretty faithful and responsible person to prophesy, to be a prophet. And so in reading this part, the kind of the conflict there, the human opposition is something that I'm not a big fan of conflict of any kind. So it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But I think the important part of that is the fact that because Amos was such a faithful doer of God, of God's word, of God's calling, he was steadfast in that, even against that human opposition. So the question for discussion and reflection would be, I guess, if this has ever happened, what is a time in your life when you have felt so strongly God's calling and God's command, his instruction in your life, that nothing would stop you from doing that or living that out?
Yeah, it's a tough place to be. I remember, I don't remember how long it was ago, it was at least 9 years ago, but when I was still in Alaska, I remember a really tough summer. It might have been even the summer before I moved here. Just really wrestling with my call, wrestling with my role, wrestling with whether I was where I should be or not, right? It's feeling very, restless is a good word for it, but not restless as in I need to leave and go somewhere, but restless as in I don't feel like I'm doing anything important, right? Is this where I should be? I feel like I'm banging my head against the wall, whatever the case may be. And so I remember I was at a youth camp. I was in charge of the NYI for Alaska, and so I went to youth camps. And we were having a prayer time early one morning, and I can't remember what precipitated it, the thought in my head, but I had a very sort of distinct, and I don't say this lightly, but a distinct time where I felt like God said something to me. And it was something like, and I can't remember the exact words. I wish if I'd had that question further ahead of time, I would have found my journal that I had written it down in. But the question was something like, God said, even if no one else goes with you, are you willing to follow? Even if, and this is very clear in my mind, because it's a very difficult question for me to answer. Even if your family didn't go along with you, would you follow? Like, are you willing to do that for me? Again, that's not because I was feeling any sort of like pushback from my family. I think God needed to ask that question, needed me to think about it. Like, because I'd never considered that I might have to make a difficult choice, like between family or God or whatever. Fortunately, I still haven't had to make that choice. But I remember God asking me that and feeling very, very deeply like, I don't know at the time. Like my first thought was, I don't know. There's not many places I would go without Jen. Jen was not willing to go. I would question whether that was God. But again, the question was not indicating that it was going to happen, but more of just, are you sure you're willing? Like, do you think this is going to be easy all the time? Are you willing to forsake houses, right, brothers, sisters, family, for the sake of following me? And I remember at the time I said yes, and that's when, truthfully, that's when things started to change for me in lots of ways, where I was willing to say, just, yeah, God, I'll go. If you want me to stay, I'll stay. If you want me to go, I'll go. If you want me to do something else, I'll do something else. If you want me to work at Starbucks the rest of my life, so be it. right? I just want to be where you want me to be. And if no one else goes with me, I guess I need to follow you and no one else. And it seems like an easy thing to say, but it's not. And I didn't have any sort of opposition, right? I haven't felt in my life a whole lot of opposition to what I do or my calling. But I really intensely feel that if God tells me to do something, I need to do it regardless of the consequences. Which it's an interesting, I take this, and this is outside your question, but I take this very seriously, that even when people say stuff to me that I think is crazy, when people say, oh, God told me this, and I'm like, that is absurd. I don't tell them it's absurd. I say, I will think and pray on that, and I need to, because my gut reaction sometimes is God would never do that, God would never say that, God would never say that Israel's destroyed, and yet here it is. And this priest at Bethel, who I'd like to think has the best intentions, at least ostensibly, or didn't start off in the priesthood to be deceptive and to tell prophets of God go elsewhere, but heard this and said, this is crazy. God's with us. We're the chosen, right? All these things that we tend to say so that we don't have to listen to prophetic critique. I very much have to listen to everything people say to me and go, is that right? Is that true? Is that from God? And there's been some wacky, off-the-wall stuff that have been said to me that ultimately I've said, I don't think that's God, because it just doesn't, I can discern that this is not godly, right? It's not from God. It doesn't follow God's character and action, either in judgment or in grace. But I have to take it through the process no matter how absurd, because I don't ever want to be in the position of Amaziah of saying to somebody, no, that's not God. Go and do that somewhere else. You're free to speak in those crazy ways, but don't do it here. To the point that when people, and this has happened, not recently, some of you may remember sometimes, but where people have stood up in church and asked me questions during a sermon or something like that, and said some, again, things that I consider pretty wacky and crazy, judgmental, right? But my first thought is generally not to dismiss or tell the person to sit down and be quiet, but to allow them to speak their piece so that the community and myself can discern, is this from God? Maybe God has raised someone up to say something in our midst and say, you are not on the right path. And if that's true, if we're not on the right path, I want to be on the right path. And so we have to discern that. And so for me, when someone says, because I've had people tell me this, God told me to say this to you, and you can tell me to shut up, but I'm not going to. I've had that happen to me before, in public and in private. And so for me, the first thing is say, okay, say your piece, but we're going to discern it collectively. We're going to take it through, and we're going to be serious. We're going to pray, God, is this what you're saying to us? God, if it is what you're saying to us, what do we do? And again, in this church, when that happened, someone said something. It was sort of wacky and crazy. It was very, very hurtful to me, what they said, because they told me basically I was being the person who was not listening to God. That's hurtful. I don't care if you're right or wrong, right? That's hurtful. But I remember being calmer than I should have, and my first thought was, my first response to that was, thank you. Now, the person left and didn't stick around, which is a clue to me. But the next thing I did is I said to the church, let's discern that. What do we do with that? I said it in front of everybody. We probably have a recording of it somewhere. And I'll never forget, someone said from the back, let's move on. Or where were we? Because the community discerned that wasn't something that was germane or true. It didn't seem like it was from God, and I trusted the discernment of the community. I don't trust the discernment of every community. I actually trust the discernment of this community. So that's straying very far from the question, but I just want to get that in there, because oftentimes we put ourselves in the role of the persecuted prophet, and probably more often than not, we are in the role of the settled priest who don't like people rocking the boat. Don't bring your yeah, I'm gonna just say it, but don't bring your social justice to me, right? You know, this country was founded on godly principles, and any talk that perhaps we have some structural issues to deal with, I don't want to hear it. The prophets are speaking, and we need to listen rather than defending the status quo. And I'm telling you this publicly because that goes for me too. I don't need to defend the status quo. That is not my job. My job is to be faithful. Your job is to be faithful. Sheldon's job is to be faithful. And God willing, if there's 100 of us in this room and some of us are trying to be faithful, hopefully we will discern rightly the voice of God in the midst. As you may have noticed, we did music first. So I'm going to thank you for being here and dismiss us until next week. Your homework is to go and to read chapter 8 of the book of Amos as we draw near to a close. We end with chapter 9, so just 1 week or 2 more weeks, and then we are done with Amos. So go read chapter 8. Thank you for being here. Have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you are when you view this. God bless. Go in peace.